There is no privilege greater than being introduced by Cindy Mabe. Such an honor and such a blessing. Good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure to have everybody here and those who are joining us virtually around the continent and around the globe as well. So part of my address today is going to be to millennials and Gen Z. And I've had to be very deliberate at being as informal as possible, you know, and just to make sure that millennials and the Gen Z don't really get caught up in the jargon of it all. And I think even most importantly, being both a data analyst and a neuropsychologist, it's quite a disaster of a combination, you know, because analyzing data becomes such a candy store for you, but it can also lead to paralysis. So in preparing my address today, I had to make sure that it was as bite-sized as possible. Going back into African possibilities, as we know, Africa is a hotspot of possibility. And even though we have a long list of vulnerabilities, I've had to think at length about the way in which we can make the environment economically viable for the youth to thrive and lead in the tech era. And part of my indebted duty to the African continent is to help analyze the transformative African conversation from a critical thinker's perspective and consider practical trade-offs in that conversation as well. So I divided the transformative steps into three areas: economic, intellectual, and social capital. So how young Africans can leverage the triad of this capital to advance themselves in the fourth industrial revolution. The first form of capital is economic capital, but I will make sure that it's related to tech. So it won't be economic capital at a macroeconomic level, it will be specifically to tech. And the most important thing about economic capital within a tech space is increasing the penetration of tech distribution in Africa, but I'll explain it a little bit more. In order to create an accelerated ecosystem in Africa, we need to begin by redefining what tech transformation really is. And I must admit that it was quite difficult for me to find a definition that I thought would do it justice. Because we would know that tech transformation, and as much as it is about digital transformation and integrating and using technologies to advance business models in an unstable work environment, it's very fluffy, right? And I've also noticed that in our pursuit to acquire digital transformation, we always use the word consumption. It's use, it's consumption, it's leveraging, but we're getting it wrong somewhere, specifically in Africa, because the definitions around tech consumption in Africa are synonyms, as I've mentioned, for consumption, but it's those keywords there, the Eurocentric assumption that a criteria for wealth in something is in the consumption rather than the ownership and the distribution. How is it that acquiring a digital technology is a measure of wealth? You having access to Facebook and putting up a status is an access to wealth. That is not easy now. Wealth, where? You know, it's about the distribution power that you have. But how do we achieve this? I think a key variable in tech transformation is in the development in Africa, of course, is not the rate of consumption, but the rate of distribution. As I've mentioned, there's no way you can have access to Facebook and assume that you've got technological wealth. So where does the younger generation start, and how can we increase the distribution power in a digital world? And I think the great starting point is in the selling and the distribution of cloud technologies, because although the pandemic will soon be over, inshallah, the adoption of remote working really is the new normal. And I think cloud computing being one of the most competitive technological and digital capabilities, with a worldwide public service of about 256 billion, it's definitely an industry that can be leveraged in terms of distribution. So don't think when I post that Instagram, you've made it in life. I think we need to transcend beyond the consumption to the distribution as well. And I think what's amazing about cloud computing, specifically with DaaS, is that it offers an inexpensive option as well to enterprises that are supporting that surge in remote workers. But going back to consumption and making sure that it's leveraged with a Pan-African backbone is to remind millennials, to also remind their European counterparts that Africa's not a dumping ground for tech consumption, but a brewing casserole of distribution and owning capacity. The African youth needs to start having these tough conversations with major tech companies to say, as much as we appreciate that investment, honey boo boo, we need to make sure that people are, and young Africans are part of the supply chain as well. And we shouldn't be having a consumption conversation if it's not accompanied by distribution. And as we know, distribution power also gives you access to data, and data's the new oil. Concluding from economic capital is the intellectual capital. And when it comes to tech in Africa, the most important thing is increasing the skills, mobility, and the adaptivity of young Africans. In South Africa, it is quite unfortunate that even though we do have the highest social progress index in the continent, our youth have some of the lowest IQs compared to our African counterparts. We're an odd standard deviation and a half lower. And it's so important that we be able to enhance this intellectual capital by engaging in massive retraining and upskilling at an individual level. You know, it's not about getting the fancy degree. It's not about going overseas. I will tell you that I've been there and done that. And a lot of my learning and a lot of the acquiring of an enhanced neural connection was being in the gritty streets of Yaoundé in Cameroon, or the dusty streets of Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, you know, and interacting with young Africans at a human-to-human level. I do acknowledge that my degree may have opened doors, but it's a lot of the flexible intellectual capital that sustained those doors as well. I'd also like to touch quite briefly on appreciative inquiry and just the assumption that we need to have resources. Thank you. The assumption that young Africans need to have resources in order to become successful, or leverage those resources to move from point A to B. And there's beauty in something called appreciative inquiry, which is the ability to leverage all of the existing small resources you have to engage in a multitude of possibility. In closing off and moving on to the next form of capital is social capital, and this is my favorite, because a very big part of increasing social capital in the digital era is predicated on enhancing the currency of human value in 4IR, but most importantly, the African social currency. And we can only enhance our social currency by strengthening those cross-collaborations around the continent. And this is to my South Africans. We've got to be able to transcend the narrow frameworks of operating in limited silos and thinking that we'll win as a country on our own. South Africa is not an island, and we wouldn't be where we are if it wasn't for the rest of the continent. I mean, Rwanda's killing it. Rwanda's killing it in the tech world, you know, building the continent's first data center. Nigeria is a multimedia powerhouse. Tanzania is finding contextualized solutions to healthcare. Ghana has opened up its doors to Africans in the diaspora and said, come back home and replow. And the question to young South Africans is, well, what are we doing beyond being South African girls and South African boys? And I think before we even start crying foul on the lack of job security compared to our foreign counterparts, we need to ask ourselves how much intellectual security we have. And I touched on this yesterday, but I think we will expand on it as we move into the panel discussion today. And I think social capital is extremely important, even as it's predicated on Ubuntu as well. The last segment of social capital within the tech space is going to be in AI. As much as humans drive tech, tech will largely be dependent on our moral and ethical and our cognitive prototyping. And because we are being automated and we're automating these intelligences will reflect our morality, So we've got to be very careful with the way we stand ethically as well as we begin to automate it. It's almost fascinating how people express animosity towards tech, accompanied by the fear that, machines will take over beyond that which we can handle. And people fail to express at a deeper level our own capacity to engage in evil and maladaptive behavior, because the fear of AI is the fear of the human being's capacity. So there would be no AI without the human being. So it's very important that we ensure that the artificial intelligence systems are predicated on integrity and ethics as well. And that sort of closes off my discussion for today, leveraging these forms of capital, acquiring more skills within the digital world as well. And I think as much as I've only touched on what the millennials and the Gen Z should focus on doing, I think it's also important that we engage in cross-collaborative partnerships at both a state and a private level as well.